My beloved child. Before you let another moment pass, there is something you need to understand about the silence that has been surrounding your heart. It was never as empty as it seemed. Somewhere beyond the words that were spoken too quickly and the conversations that ended too soon, the person you love left something unfinished. Not an ordinary message. Not a casual apology written in a passing moment. It was the kind of truth a person writes only when they finally become afraid that silence may cost them someone they cannot replace. And the most important part is not what they said first. It is what they almost erased before leaving it behind. The message began late at night, in a room lit by the pale glow of a single screen. Outside, rain had begun tapping softly against the window, and every sound seemed louder because they were alone. They had tried to sleep. They had turned the pillow, closed their eyes, and told themselves that tomorrow would make everything easier. But tomorrow had already come too many times without changing what they felt. So they reached for the phone and opened the conversation they had avoided for days. Your name was still there, resting above all those old words like a door they were afraid to open. Their fingers hovered over the keyboard. They typed, "I hope you're doing well," then deleted it because it sounded too distant. They wrote, "I've been thinking about you," then erased that too because it did not come close to the truth. What they wanted to admit was heavier. It had followed them through crowded places, ordinary mornings, and conversations where they smiled at the right moments while feeling completely absent inside. But how could they explain that losing your presence had changed the atmosphere of their entire life without sounding dramatic? And how could they ask whether you still cared when they were the one who had made you question it? They set the phone down and walked toward the window. Streetlights trembled in the rain, turning the glass into a moving reflection. For a moment, they saw their own face layered over the darkness outside. They looked tired, but it was not the kind of tired that sleep could repair. It was the exhaustion of carrying words that had nowhere to go. Then a memory returned without warning, the sound of your voice during one of your last honest conversations, when you had asked them a simple question they never truly answered. Do you want me in your life, or do you only want me when you're afraid of losing me? At the time, they had looked away. They had changed the subject. They had convinced themselves that avoiding the question was safer than answering it. But now, in the stillness of that rain-soaked night, your words returned with a clarity that left no room to hide. They finally understood that you had not been demanding reassurance. You had been asking for truth. And the truth was that they had wanted you deeply, but they had been terrified of what loving you would require them to confront within themselves. That was the first thing they wrote in the message. They admitted that you had seen parts of them they had spent years hiding. You noticed when their laughter changed. You heard hesitation behind their confident words. You recognized the moments when they pulled away, not because they cared less, but because they were beginning to care more than they knew how to manage. Being understood by you felt beautiful, but it also felt dangerous. It meant they could no longer pretend that their old wounds were gone. It meant someone finally stood close enough to see the fear beneath their independence. Yet even after writing this, they stopped again. Because there was another truth beneath it, one they were not sure you would forgive. A few days before they wrote the message, someone had asked them about you. It happened unexpectedly in a quiet cafe, the kind with warm wooden tables and music low enough for private conversations. They had been sitting across from a trusted friend when your name came up. At first, they tried to answer casually. They said things had become complicated. They claimed that perhaps the connection had simply reached its natural end. But the friend did not believe them. You don't talk about someone that way when you're finished with them, the friend said. They laughed softly, but their hands tightened around the coffee cup. What way? Like every memory still has a heartbeat. The words unsettled them. They looked toward the window, watching people pass beneath umbrellas, and suddenly they could no longer maintain the story they had been telling everyone, including themselves. Their voice lowered. They confessed that they still reread your old messages. They admitted they sometimes opened your profile and stared at your picture without knowing what they hoped to find. They revealed that they had started measuring time by the last moment they felt truly known, and every road led back to you. But their friend asked one question that changed the conversation. If you love them, why did you make them feel unwanted? That question followed them home. It was there while they removed their coat. It was there as they stood in the kitchen with the refrigerator door open, forgetting what they had come to find. It was there when they passed a mirror and remembered how often pride had spoken for them while love remained silent. They began replaying moments they had dismissed before, the way your expression changed when they became emotionally distant, the pause in your voice when you realized you were asking for care that should have been offered freely, the final look you gave them when you decided not to explain your pain again. They had believed you would always understand. They had mistaken your patience for permanence. And that realization became the second part of the message. They wrote that you were never too sensitive. You were never asking for too much. You were responding to the uncertainty they created. Each time you reached for clarity, they gave you confusion. Each time you needed consistency, they offered intense affection followed by unexplained distance. They saw now that the hardest part was not merely that they hurt you. It was that they made you doubt your own instincts while doing it. The words became more honest with every sentence. They described the exact moment they realized you might truly be moving on. It was not because they saw you with someone else. It was something quieter. They noticed that you had stopped trying to be understood. You no longer sent the long messages. You no longer asked what had changed. You no longer returned to the same conversation hoping for a different ending. Your silence was not punishment. It was acceptance. And somehow, that frightened them more than anger ever could. Anger would have meant you were still standing at the door. Silence suggested you had begun walking away. That was when they almost called you. Their thumb rested over your name. The room felt unusually still, as though everything around them had paused to witness the choice. But they did not press the button. Fear interrupted again. What if you did not answer? What if you answered but sounded different? What if your voice no longer carried that softness they had once taken for granted? They convinced themselves they needed more time to prepare the right words. But deep down, they knew preparation was not the real issue. They were afraid the truth had arrived too late. So they returned to the message and wrote the sentence they had avoided for the longest time. I know I made you feel as though loving you was difficult, but the difficult thing was never loving you. It was believing I deserved to be loved the way you loved me. After writing it, they stared at the screen for several minutes. That sentence opened a memory they had never shared with you. Long before you entered their life, they learned to associate love with instability. Affection was offered, then withdrawn. Promises were made, then forgotten. People said they cared, but disappeared when closeness became inconvenient. So they built a version of themselves that needed no one. They became skilled at leaving emotionally before anyone could leave them physically. It protected them for years. Then you arrived. You did not force your way past their defenses. You simply remained honest. You asked questions no one else asked. You remembered small details. You noticed when they were pretending to be fine, but you did not embarrass them by exposing it. You gave them room without making them feel abandoned. And slowly, almost without realizing it, they began depending on the steadiness of your presence. That dependence terrified them. Instead of telling you, they tested you. They became distant to see whether you would stay. They withheld affection to see whether you would fight for it. They created small storms and watched to see whether you would leave. Every time you remained, they felt relieved. But every test left a mark on you. And eventually, you stopped proving what should never have been doubted. The message grew longer. They told you they had no excuse for the pain they caused. They did not blame their past. They did not ask you to forget what happened. They wrote that understanding their behavior did not erase its consequences. This was not a message designed to pull you back into the same cycle. It was the first time they were trying to speak without hiding behind charm, sorrow, or promises they had not yet earned the right to make. Then they revealed something unexpected. They had begun changing before they knew whether you would ever return. They had started speaking honestly with someone about the fears they used to bury. They had apologized to a family member for years of emotional distance. They had written down every moment in your connection where they chose self-protection over tenderness, not to punish themselves, but to recognize the pattern clearly enough to stop repeating it. For the first time, their growth was not based on convincing you to stay. It was based on becoming someone who would no longer damage what they claimed to value. But even that was not the biggest revelation. Near the end of the message, their tone changed. The sentences became shorter. Less polished. More vulnerable. It was as though they had finally reached the reason they began writing in the first place. They wrote, "There is something I never told you about the day everything changed between us." That day, you believed they had become cold without explanation. You thought perhaps their feelings had weakened. You remembered the delayed replies, the strange distance in their voice, the way they avoided making plans. You assumed you had done something wrong, though they repeatedly insisted nothing was wrong at all. But something had happened. That morning, they had received news that shook the foundation of their life. It was not a tragedy, but it forced them to confront a future they had been avoiding. A long-standing responsibility, one tied to family and choices made years earlier, had suddenly returned. They felt cornered by expectations they had never told you about. And rather than trusting you with the truth, they decided you would be better off without the burden of their complications. They began pulling away because they thought distance would protect you. But instead of protecting you, they wounded you without explanation. They wrote that every cold response was followed by regret. Every time they ignored your call, they sat staring at the screen after it stopped ringing. Every time you asked whether they still cared, the answer inside them was yes, but fear kept translating it into silence. They believed that if they made you disappointed enough, you would leave before their life became too heavy for you. What they did not understand was that you never asked them for a perfect life. You asked them to let you stand beside the real one. And then came the line they almost deleted. The cursor rested behind it for a long time as they considered erasing everything. Their breathing changed. Their eyes filled, not because they expected sympathy, but because saying it clearly meant accepting what they had almost destroyed. They wrote, "I did not leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I had already made a decision about us, and I was too afraid to tell you what it was." That sentence remained unfinished for several minutes. The rain had stopped by then. The room was completely silent. Their phone battery was nearly empty, but they refused to connect the charger, as though any interruption might break the courage they had finally found. They scrolled upward, reading every confession from the beginning. Then they returned to the final line and added 6 words. Words that changed the meaning of everything you thought had happened. Words that revealed their distance had not begun with a desire to end the connection. It had begun after they secretly visited a place you once spoke about, a place connected to the future you had imagined together. And what they did there was something they never expected to confess in a message. They had gone there carrying a question. They had left carrying an answer. But just as they began writing what that answer was, another notification appeared on the screen. It was your name. And the message you sent them at that exact moment made them freeze before they could finish the confession. Your message contained only 7 words. I found what you never meant me to see. The person you love read that sentence once, then again, as though the meaning might change if they stared long enough. The unfinished confession remained beneath their thumb, glowing on the screen while the room seemed to narrow around them. For weeks, they had imagined every possible response from you: anger, indifference, even silence, but not this. Not the possibility that the truth had reached you before they found the courage to deliver it. They typed your name, stopped, and deleted it. Then they wrote, "What did you find?" The message showed as delivered immediately. No reply came. A minute passed. Then another. Outside, water slid from the rooftops and gathered along the empty street. A car moved through the intersection, its headlights sweeping briefly across the walls before disappearing. They remained seated at the edge of the bed, phone held tightly in both hands, listening to the faint ticking of a clock they had never noticed before. Each second felt like a door closing somewhere beyond their reach. What had you seen? The photograph? The receipt? The folded page hidden inside the book they had once borrowed from you? Or had someone told you about the place they visited? That last possibility tightened something in their chest. Only one other person knew where they had gone that afternoon, and that person had promised not to speak. But promises changed when people believed they were protecting someone. Perhaps the secret had become too heavy for another pair of hands to carry. Your reply finally appeared. Not over text. Their breath caught. They looked at the time. It was far later than either of you usually spoke. Yet beneath those 3 words, another message arrived. Call me before I change my mind. They pressed the button instantly. The first ring felt endless. The second made their heartbeat rise into their throat. Halfway through the third, you answered, but neither of you spoke. There was only the soft sound of your breathing and a distant hum behind you, perhaps a fan or the road outside. The silence was not awkward. It was full crowded with every sentence neither of you had been brave enough to say. Finally, they whispered, "What did you find?" Your response came quietly. The envelope. Their eyes closed. Of all the things you could have discovered, it had been the one object that held the beginning of everything. The envelope had been cream-colored, thick, and carefully sealed. Your name was written across the front in their handwriting, but there was no address, no stamp, and no date. They had carried it for nearly 2 months, moving it from a drawer to a coat pocket, from the coat pocket to the glove compartment, and finally into the old wooden box at the place you once dreamed of visiting together. They had never intended for you to see it yet. "Where are you?" they asked. You did not answer immediately. Instead, you said, "Tell me why it was there." Their mind returned to the day they made the journey. The sky had been bright but overcast, the light spreading evenly across miles of open road. They drove beyond the city, past familiar exits and into the countryside where buildings became fewer and fields stretched wide beneath the horizon. You had described the place to them once during a late conversation, when both of you were still unguarded enough to speak about impossible futures. It was a small hill above a lake. At the top stood an abandoned stone chapel, no longer used for services but still cared for by an elderly groundskeeper. Behind it grew a single magnolia tree that bloomed for only a short time each year. You had seen a photograph online and said that, one day, you wanted to stand there with the person you would build a life beside. At the time, they had teased you for being sentimental. But they had remembered every detail. When they arrived, the chapel door was unlocked. Sunlight entered through narrow windows, illuminating dust that drifted in the air like tiny sparks. The wooden benches were worn smooth, and a faint scent of rain-soaked stone lingered inside, though it had not rained that day. They walked to the front carrying the envelope and something else concealed in their hand. Not a ring. Not yet. It was a small brass key. You did not know about the key because they had never told you what it opened. They had recently inherited a modest house from a relative who lived near the lake. It was not grand. The roof needed work, the kitchen belonged to another decade, and vines had begun climbing over one side of the porch. But when they first stepped inside, they saw something they had not allowed themselves to imagine before. A shared table by the window. 2 cups left beside the sink. Your books filling the empty shelves. The quiet sound of you moving through another room. The vision frightened them because it did not feel like fantasy. It felt possible. That was the decision they had made about the two of you. They wanted to offer you a real place in their future. But before they could tell you, the responsibility from their past returned. The house was connected to an unresolved family dispute. Another relative believed the property should belong to them and threatened legal action. What had seemed like a peaceful beginning suddenly became a source of conflict. The person you love feared inviting you into a future that could collapse before it started. So instead of sharing the dream and the complication, they hid both. On the phone, you asked again, why was the envelope there? They opened their eyes and stared at the unfinished message on the screen. Because I went there to decide whether I was ready to ask you something. Your breathing changed. What? They stood and began pacing across the room, each step carrying them closer to the truth. I wanted to ask whether you would come see the house with me. The silence that followed was different from the first. It held surprise, but beneath it was something sharper. The house, you said. So that's what the key is for. They stopped moving. You have the key? Yes. A strange feeling passed through them, not relief, not panic, but the sudden awareness that the future they had hidden was now resting in your hand. You explained how you found the envelope. Earlier that evening, you had received a call from the elderly groundskeeper at the chapel. Months ago, during one of your conversations about the place, you had sent an inquiry asking whether visitors were allowed inside. Your number remained in the chapel's handwritten visitor log. The groundskeeper had found the envelope in a wooden box beneath the magnolia tree after heavy wind dislodged the lid. Because your name was written on it, he searched the old log and contacted you. You had driven there before sunset. You went alone. By the time you arrived, the clouds had broken apart and the lake reflected a thin band of golden light. The groundskeeper met you near the gate. He said someone had visited several weeks earlier, carrying the envelope and asking whether items could be left safely in the box. The visitor seemed nervous, he recalled, but not uncertain. He said he was preparing for a conversation that could change his life, the old man told you. Your hands trembled when he passed you the envelope. Inside, you found the brass key and a letter. But the letter was not an apology. It had been written before everything between you fell apart. That mattered more than anything. It meant their vision of a future with you had not been created by loneliness after losing you. It existed while you were still together, while you were still questioning whether they took the connection seriously. During the very period when they appeared most hesitant, they had secretly been imagining permanence. You read part of the letter aloud on the phone. I know I have spent too much time pretending I do not think about the future. The truth is, I think about it every time you tell me something ordinary. When you complain about the way you like your coffee, I wonder what kind of cups we would own. When you talk about needing quiet after a long day, I imagine learning how to give it to you without making you feel alone. When you mention a place you would like to visit, I picture the drive before I picture the destination. Your voice became unsteady, but you continued. This key does not promise a perfect home. It opens a house that needs patience, honesty, and work. Perhaps that is why it made me think of us, not because we are broken, but because beautiful things do not always arrive finished. They lowered their head. They remembered writing those words at the kitchen counter of the empty house, sunlight resting across the floorboards while birds called from the overgrown yard. At the time, they had believed they would hand you the letter within days. Then fear had rewritten the story. What happened to you, you asked. How did someone who wrote this become the person who pushed me away? There was no accusation in your voice. That made the question harder. They sat down again. I received a letter from my family the morning I started distancing myself. This was the part they had avoided putting into the unfinished message. Not because it involved wrongdoing or scandal, but because it exposed an old loyalty that had controlled far too many choices. The relative challenging the inheritance was their older sibling. For years, that sibling had carried much of the family's financial burden. When their parents struggled, it was the sibling who paid bills, handled emergencies, and sacrificed opportunities. The house had belonged to an aunt who felt close to the person you love, but distant from the sibling. When the aunt left the property to them alone, the decision reopened wounds no one had addressed. The sibling did not merely want the house. They wanted acknowledgement. They believed the inheritance proved that their sacrifices had gone unseen. The person you love felt caught between gratitude and fairness. Keeping the property seemed like betrayal. Giving it away felt like surrendering the first future they had ever chosen for themselves. They could not bear the thought of asking you to join them in a dream built on someone else's resentment. So they made a decision without you. They planned to transfer the house to their sibling and erase the future they had imagined. That was why the key remained in the envelope. That was why they could not bring themselves to give it to you. But something had changed since then. 3 days earlier, the sibling had requested a meeting. They met at the inherited house just before noon. The garden was damp from morning rain, and fallen leaves had collected on the porch steps. Inside, the rooms echoed as they walked through them. The sibling said very little at first, moving from room to room with an expression the person you love could not read. Finally, they entered the kitchen. On the counter lay several old photographs the aunt had stored in a drawer. One showed both siblings as children, standing beside the same house. The older sibling held a toy shovel while the younger one, the person you love, stood beneath the magnolia branches with dirt on their knees. The sibling picked up the photograph. "I don't want the house," they said. The person you love thought they had misunderstood. "But your letter dash. I wrote it when I was angry." The sibling admitted the inheritance had made them feel forgotten. But after weeks of thought, they realized taking the house would not heal that feeling. What they wanted was a conversation about everything the family had expected them to carry, and why no one had ever asked whether they were tired. Then the sibling said something the person you love never expected. "Our aunt left this place to you because you were the only one who loved it before it was worth anything." The legal challenge was withdrawn that afternoon. The house was theirs. The obstacle that had caused them to retreat from you was gone. Yet instead of feeling instantly free, they felt the full weight of what their silence had cost. The situation could have been survived through honesty. The relationship might have grown stronger if they had trusted you enough to let you see the uncertainty. They had nearly lost you not because the future was impossible, but because they tried to protect that future by excluding you from it. On the phone, you remained quiet for a long time. Then you asked, "Were you ever going to tell me any of this?" "Yes." "When?" They looked at the long message still waiting unsent. "Tonight." You gave a soft, breathless laugh, but there was sadness inside it. "Tonight, after I found the letter." "No. I started writing before you contacted me." They sent the unfinished message while still on the call. You received it a moment later. They heard the quiet sound of your screen unlocking, followed by a silence in which they imagined you reading every admission. The room felt suspended around them. There was nothing left to control. No explanation they could rearrange. The truth now belonged to you, and whatever happened next would be your choice. Several minutes passed. When you finally spoke, your voice had changed. It was softer, but not reconciled. You said you made a decision about us at the chapel. I did. Was the decision only to show me the house? They looked toward the window. The clouds had begun thinning, revealing a small patch of night sky. No. Your breathing became still. They reached into the drawer beside the bed and removed a second envelope. Unlike the first, this one was dark blue and sealed with a thin strip of wax. It contained the final page they had not left at the chapel because they had not been ready to place it beyond their control. What else did you decide? You asked. Their fingers traced the edge of the envelope. I decided that if I ever found the courage to stop running from the life I wanted, I would ask you to meet me beneath that magnolia tree. Why? Because there is something hidden inside the chapel wall. You said nothing. They explained that while speaking with the groundskeeper during their first visit, they learned an old tradition connected to the chapel. Decades ago, people placed handwritten vows inside a narrow compartment behind a loose stone near the front. Not wedding vows, necessarily. Promises of every kind, promises to return, to forgive, to begin again, to become honest before it was too late. The person you love had placed a promise there. A promise addressed to you. They had not expected you to discover the envelope, but they had always hoped that one day, when everything was finally clear, they would bring you to the chapel and read the promise aloud. You asked, "Is it still there?" Yes. How do you know? Because I checked 3 days ago. They had returned after the meeting with their sibling. The wind was strong that afternoon, bending the tall grass along the path. They entered the chapel, removed the loose stone, and found the folded page exactly where they had left it. They considered taking it away. The circumstances had changed. Perhaps too much damage had been done for the promise to matter. But they left it there. Not as an expectation. As evidence of who they had chosen to become, whether you came back or not. What does it say? You whispered. They stood holding the blue envelope. I can tell you. No, you said. The answer startled them. Then you added, I want to read it where you left it. For the first time that night, hope entered the room, but it arrived carefully, without certainty. They did not allow themselves to interpret your words as forgiveness. Curiosity was not reconciliation. Willingness to listen was not a promise to stay. Still, you wanted to meet. You agreed on the following afternoon, just before sunset. Neither of you said what the meeting would mean. When the call ended, they remained standing beside the bed, listening to the silence that returned. But it no longer felt empty. It felt like the space before a truth takes physical form. The next day, they arrived at the chapel early. The sky was clear, and the lake below the hill shimmered beneath the late afternoon light. Magnolia petals lay scattered across the ground, pale and soft against the dark soil. The person you love waited near the tree, carrying the dark blue envelope in one hand and a small wooden box in the other. Inside the box was not jewelry. It held something far more personal. A collection of objects from your history together, the movie ticket from your first unexpected evening out, the tiny paper wrapper from the candy you once shared during a long drive, a pressed leaf from the park where you first admitted you were afraid of losing each other. Each object had been kept quietly, evidence that moments you thought they barely noticed had mattered enough to preserve. But beneath those memories was one final item. A document. Signed that morning. You appeared at the edge of the path as the sun began lowering behind the trees. For a moment, neither of you moved. The distance between you was no more than a few yards, but it held every misunderstanding, every unsent message, and every night spent wondering whether the connection had been real. You carried the cream-colored envelope in one hand. The brass key rested in the other. They watched you approach, and the expression on your face revealed nothing. No smile. No anger. Only a calmness that made them realize you had not come to be persuaded. You had come to decide what the truth meant for you. Without speaking, you walked together toward the chapel. Inside, the air was cool. Evening light passed through the narrow windows, stretching long golden shapes across the floor. The person you love moved toward the loose stone near the front, knelt, and removed it carefully. The compartment was empty. They froze. The promise was gone. You stared into the dark opening, then looked at them. You said you checked 3 days ago. I did. It was here. A floorboard creaked behind you. Both of you turned. The elderly groundskeeper stood near the doorway, holding a folded piece of paper. His expression was gentle, but troubled. I took it this morning, he said. Someone came looking for it. The person you love stepped forward. Who? The groundskeeper looked from them to you, then down at the paper in his hand. A woman who knew both your names. He explained that she arrived shortly after sunrise. She said the promise inside the wall concerned her too and that reading it before your meeting might prevent a serious mistake. The groundskeeper refused to give it to her, but after she left, he removed the paper for safekeeping. You asked the question first. What woman? The groundskeeper described her. The moment he mentioned the silver pendant around her neck, the person you love lost all color. You recognized the reaction immediately. You know who she is. They did. And suddenly the wooden box in their hand felt dangerously heavy, because the signed document beneath the memories had been created partly because of that woman. They looked at you, knowing there was no gentle way to reveal what came next. She is the reason the house was left to me, they said. Your fingers tightened around the key. What does that mean? Before they could answer, the groundskeeper held out the folded promise. There is something written on the back, he said. Something that was not there when it was first placed inside the wall. The person you love unfolded the page. Their original promise filled the front in familiar handwriting. But on the reverse side, someone had added a single sentence in dark ink. A sentence addressed directly to you. They read it silently, and their expression changed from confusion to disbelief. You reached for the page. What does it say? They hesitated only a second before turning it toward you. And beneath your name were the words. Before you accept the key, ask them whose child is named in the deed. The words on the page seemed to silence even the wind outside the chapel. Before you accept the key, ask them whose child is named in the deed. You looked up slowly, your eyes searching the face of the person you loved. There was no anger in your expression, now only the need for truth. After everything that had happened, neither of you wanted another secret, another half-answer, or another conversation interrupted by fear. The person you loved closed their eyes for a moment and drew a long breath. I hoped you would never have to discover it this way. The elderly groundskeeper quietly stepped outside, leaving the two of you alone beneath the warm evening light filtering through the chapel windows. The silence no longer felt threatening. It felt respectful, as though even the old stone walls understood that honesty deserved room to breathe. The child mentioned in the deed. They began softly, isn't mine. You remained still. It was my aunt's final wish. They unfolded the legal document from the wooden box and carefully handed it to you. My aunt created a trust connected to the property years before she passed away. She spent much of her life helping children who had lost their families. One little boy especially stayed close to her heart after she volunteered at a local community home. She couldn't legally adopt him because of her health, but she quietly arranged for part of her estate to support his education and future. You continued reading. The deed explained everything. The house belonged to the person you loved, but one small section of the land had been permanently protected. If it were ever sold, a portion of the proceeds would always go into the educational trust created for that child until he reached adulthood. No hidden family. No secret life. Only a promise made by a compassionate woman who wanted one forgotten child to have opportunities she herself never had. The mysterious sentence written on the back of the promise had been designed to create suspicion where none truly existed. You looked up again. Who wrote that? A quiet sadness crossed their face. I think I know. They explained that the woman wearing the silver pendant had once been very close to their aunt. She believed the house should never have left the family. When every legal challenge failed, she tried something different. If she could make you doubt the person you loved, perhaps your relationship would collapse on its own, and the house would become another burden they might eventually abandon. She didn't understand something, they said gently. What? That love built on honesty survives questions. It doesn't fear them. The sentence settled into the stillness between you. For the first time in many months, there were no more missing pieces. No hidden letters. No unfinished explanations. No imagined betrayals. Only two imperfect people standing before one another with nothing left to hide. You slowly unfolded the promise that had been hidden inside the chapel wall. The handwriting was steady. It read, "If the day ever comes when fear convinces me to run, I pray I will find the courage to return before love becomes another unfinished story. If you are reading this beside me, then thank you for believing that people can grow. If you are reading this without me, I hope you still know that meeting you changed the measure of my life forever. You taught me that real love is not proven by perfect words. It is proven by becoming someone worthy of the trust they have been given. No matter what happens next, Thank you for showing me the kind of person I wanted to become." By the time you reached the final line, tears quietly blurred the ink. Not tears of heartbreak. Not even tears of relief. They were the gentle tears that come when the weight of misunderstanding finally begins to lift. You lowered the paper. "You really wrote this before everything fell apart?" "I did." "And every word is still true?" They didn't answer immediately. Instead, they stepped forward with remarkable calm, leaving only enough space for you to choose whether the distance would disappear. "I don't want another chance because I'm lonely." Their voice remained steady. "I don't want forgiveness because it would make my life easier." They smiled faintly. "I want to spend whatever time I'm given becoming the person those words describe, whether that journey includes you or not." Those words changed everything. For months you had expected promises. Instead, you received responsibility. You had expected dramatic declarations. Instead, you found quiet maturity. You had expected someone asking to be rescued. Instead, you found someone who had already begun changing before knowing whether reconciliation was even possible. That difference mattered. Outside, the evening breeze carried magnolia petals across the chapel steps. Without speaking, you walked together toward the old house overlooking the lake. The front door opened with the same brass key that had waited inside the envelope for so long. The house was exactly as described. Simple. Peaceful. Unfinished. Sunlight entered through wide windows, warming the wooden floors. Dust floated through the golden light while birds sang somewhere beyond the garden. Nothing about it was perfect. One cabinet leaned slightly. The paint needed refreshing. The porch creaked with every step. Yet somehow, it felt more beautiful because it wasn't pretending to be complete. Standing inside that quiet home, both of you finally understood something that had taken the entire journey to reveal. Love had never been asking either of you to become flawless. It had only been asking for honesty. The strongest relationships are not built by people who never struggle. They are built by people who stop hiding their struggles from one another. The person you loved placed the wooden memory box on the kitchen table. "You can keep it," they said. You opened it once more. The movie ticket. The pressed leaf. The candy wrapper. Small moments. Ordinary moments. Proof that what often feels insignificant while we're living it may later become the very memories that remind us who we are. You smiled. Not because every wound had disappeared. Healing rarely happens in a single afternoon. You smiled because the future no longer depended on guessing. It could finally be built on truth. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the lake, the two of you stepped onto the porch together. The horizon glowed with soft shades of gold and amber. No grand speeches were needed. Some endings are powerful precisely because they are quiet. Some miracles are simply two hearts choosing honesty over fear. And perhaps that is the greatest message this story leaves behind. If you are carrying words you've been afraid to speak, if you have allowed fear to write chapters that love never intended, remember that sincere truth, offered with humility, has the power to begin a completely different ending. Not every relationship is meant to continue. Not every goodbye becomes another hello. But every honest conversation leaves the heart lighter than silence ever could. May you always have the courage to choose truth over pride, compassion over assumption, and hope over fear. May your heart recognize the people who genuinely value it. May your path be filled with peace, wisdom, and relationships that grow stronger through honesty. And may every new beginning in your life be built on trust that lasts. If this fictional story touched your heart, brought you comfort, or reminded you of the importance of honest communication, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Until our next story, may peace, light, and quiet strength stay with you always.